Welcome everyone. I am Marianne Cosgrove, Acting Chair of Humanists Australia. I'm here in Canberra with my husband, David. Before we begin this session, I wish to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land and that sovereignty was never ceded. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. It's important that we remember whose land it is on which we tread, treat them respectfully as equals, and speak up when we see them suffering from injustice. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be made available to the public through the Humanists Australia YouTube channel and other media. Please turn your video camera off if you're concerned for your privacy. We have with us today Katja Strela. Can you give us a wave, Katja? Hi. Katja is a PhD student undertaking research on the experience of women in humanist, rationalist and atheist organisations in Australia for Western Sydney University. If anyone has any concerns about her presence here tonight, please let me know now or via email mac@humanistaustralia.org. Okay, so today is International Human Rights Day, a fitting day on which to launch Humanists Australia. Some of you will recall an open national meeting held in June to discuss the possibility of creating a new national humanist organisation. At the time, I said, we have an opportunity for creating a new home for Australian humanists that is founded with a culture of mutual respect and cooperation. We need a home that inspires us and rewards our initiative, creativity and enthusiasm. A home that gives practical on-the-ground support for humanist communities that want to play an active part in shaping our broader society. Humanists Australia is that new home. We envisage a future where every Australian knows what humanism is and can join a supportive, inclusive humanist community. And we are an influential voice, affecting positive social change in keeping with humanist values. To fulfill that vision, we'll work towards four main goals. Firstly, education. We believe that many Australians are humanist at heart, but don't yet know that's what they are. We aim to reach out to the public through online resources that we host on our website, through social media, through merchandise, and through activities such as discussion groups and presentations. The video recordings of our Launchapalooza sessions will be included in those resources. Tomorrow is Activities Day with a panel session featuring activity leaders. I'll be giving an educational presentation, What is Humanism? And Liz Foreman will run a discussion session on the topic, Is far-right populism being driven by a failure in addressing the human rights of disenfranchised segments of the population? Secondly, communities. We're beginning to provide support for the creation and growth of humanist communities around Australia. Just this week, the ACT Humanist Society members made the decision to merge with Humanists Australia to become a community supported by us. Saturday is Community Day. It begins with a discussion on the importance of community with Tim Hollow, Executive Director of the Green Institute. Next up is a panel session featuring humanist community leaders. Finish up on Saturday at one of our local community dinners in Adelaide, Brisbane, Canberra, Melbourne or Sydney, or join Sue James online if you can make it to one of those in person. Give us a wave, Sue. There's Sue. She's a really friendly face. So if you haven't got a dinner to go to, have dinner with Sue online. Thirdly, support. We aim to support people persecuted as a result of their humanist beliefs, both in Australia and working with Humanists International overseas. On Saturday afternoon, one of the community panelists will be Les Allen, leader of the Ex-Religious Support Network, who will be talking about the support offered by that community. Other ways in which Humanists Australia supports people will be discussed at the What Do We Do Here session with activity leaders on Friday morning. Goal 4 is activism. Humanists Australia will be advocating for policies that reduce societal inequalities, advance secularism, advance human rights, and improve quality of life, guided by reason and evidence. Sunday is Activism Day and features talks by Lyndon Story on the Human Union Project and Dr. Anna Greta Hunter, Chair of the Commission for the Human Future. At lunchtime each day, there'll be an open session in which you can eat your lunch while chatting socially with other Humanists Australia members over Zoom. I hope we see you there. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Andrew Copson, coming to us today from the UK. Andrew is president of Humanists International, the umbrella body bringing the global humanist movement together to pursue human rights at an international level. He joined the Humanists International board in 2010 and has been serving as president since 2015. He's also the CEO of Humanists UK, responsible for day-to-day management of the organisation as a whole and management of their staff team. I'm looking forward to the day when we have a staff team. Prior to that, he worked across educational and public affairs roles within the same organisation. Recently, Andrew, together with Professor Alice Roberts, President of Humanists UK, has published The Little Book on Humanism, a wonderful collection of humanist thoughts that I can thoroughly recommend. Andrew's holding it up for you now. I have my copy online. Stella's got a copy there. Over to you, Andrew. Oh, sorry,
Well,
just as he was taking a sip of tea.
That's okay, it happens. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. Congratulations on the launch of this new vehicle for humanism in Australia, which is wonderful to see. And welcome from Humanists International, given that you're our most recent new member globally. And the board was very pleased to approve your membership application, to look forward to many decades of working with you for the growth of humanism in Australia and around the world.
Thank you, Andrew.
My pleasure. Humanist organisations all around the world are incredibly diverse, of course, depending on the culture of the country from which they originated, and also very often they're diverse in other ways. So in the global south, we find that humanist organisations have an average age of membership of about sort of 23. In the west, we find a very different demographic. They're diverse in that sense, but of course what holds them all united, what we all have in common, is our humanist approach to life. But it's more than that as well. Humanist organisations around the world, although they're very diverse in cultural terms, also have a pretty consistent model of activities. Humanist organisations are places where people gather. They share a fellowship based on their like-mindedness. They find a sort of community there, as we've just been hearing you hope to do in Australia. That's valuable all over the world. It's particularly valuable, of course, in countries where humanists are committing a criminal offence by being humanists, which is still a couple of dozen countries in the world, very difficult, inhospitable environments in which to be non-religious, and even more so in which to identify as a humanist or try to set up a humanist organisation. So a community, fellowship, a coming together, that's one very important goal of humanist organisations all around the world. The second is that humanist organisations almost everywhere provide community services. So again, this varies depending on where they are in the world. In many parts of the world, especially in the West, the most common community service is ceremonies, so funerals, weddings, other types of significant life event ceremonies. In some parts of the world, it's pastoral care. In other parts of the world, it's adoption services, housing associations, the sort of social services that many people in the richer world take for granted, but that in other parts of the world are still provided by civil and community groups, most often churches or religious organisations, which again, therefore, humanists are cut off from access to, where there aren't systems of social service that are secular, provided by the state or provided by other NGOs. So community services are an important part of the work of humanist organisations everywhere, and humanist organisations everywhere also provide advocacy. They speak, as we've just been hearing you intend to do, they speak on behalf not only of humanists and a humanist view of society, a view of an open society, a secular state, a world of freedom and fairness, where people have choice, and up to the limits, of course, always in a liberal society, of the choice freedoms of others. But also, specifically as well, the rights of humanists, of people who are not religious, or more specifically, people with humanist beliefs, who are discriminated against, oppressed, persecuted, as they are in so many parts of the world. And Dr. Ahmed Shahid, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for freedom of religion or belief, has said that the non-religious are the most viciously persecuted minority in the world. He says other minorities may be persecuted in greater numbers, but humanists, he says specifically, and the non-religious, where they're persecuted, are persecuted most viciously. It's the role of Humanists International to bring together humanist organizations around the world, which we do, and also to represent humanist opinion globally at international institutions. So we provide to our member organizations, the number of which are growing all the time, support at whatever stage in their development they might be. That includes new and emerging organizations like yours. It includes stimulating organizations out of one or two scattered humanists that we might be in contact with in particular countries like Pakistan, or in the past Uganda and Nigeria, and increasingly now places in Southeast Asia. So stimulating, supporting new organizations, but also networking together the older, more established organizations. There's a huge difference between Humanists UK, for example, established in 1896, 100,000 members and supporters, or the Norwegian Humanist Association, state funded together with the Norwegian Church. We don't like that in principle, but the Norwegian Humanists accept state money for as long as the church gets it. Obviously, they also campaign for that money to stop. The Norwegian Humanist Association, as I say, also large, 100,000 members, a massive part of Norwegian national life. Those organizations and the handful of humanists who are able to meet at any one time in coffee shops in Pakistan in secret because their lives would be in danger if they were meeting in public, and their very existence as an organization is a criminal offense. They couldn't have a launch event like yours this weekend. But across that range of humanist organizations, Humanists International seeks to support them all in their own capacity building, but also to network them together into a global movement. And then we work ourselves directly at the international institutions. So at the United Nations in New York and in Geneva, specifically at the Human Rights Council, we're a recognized NGO to the Human Rights Council, which means we can speak, we can lobby, we can work with states on matters of human rights on our agenda. At the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is a regional, African regional body for human rights, at Strasbourg in the Council of Europe, and increasingly at other regional bodies. Our delegations argue for a more secular state and for more open society across the world. And then the third thing that we do at Humanists International, as well as support our members and network them and argue for humanist policies at the international level, is support individual humanists persecuted around the world. In a way, this is all part of our work of trying to promote humanism in different parts of the world, because it's impossible for humanist organizations to even form, never mind to do the sort of work that they do so successfully in the countries where they're well established and well resourced. It's impossible for them to form if individual humanists don't have freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of belief. And over the world in the last few years, there has unfortunately been a rising tide of persecution of any dissenters, free thinkers, humanists specifically, especially in Islamic states and in Southeast Asia, but also in states where there's a rising Christian nationalism, countries like Russia, countries like Hungary, countries that have adopted a sort of right-wing ethnic populism, which is as damaging to humanist values and a humanist view of society as religious extremism is. We've seen humanist students in Pakistan post on their social media one day that they're humanists and be lynched, murdered by their fellow students the next day. We've seen humanist bloggers hacked to death in the street of Bangladesh, in Dhaka, while the police stand and watch and do nothing. We've seen humanists thrown into prison. Our colleague Mubarak Bala, president of the Nigerian Humanist Association, been in prison now for over 6 months without legal representation, without the opportunity to argue his case. We've seen humanist activists in India, where rising Hindu nationalism has created a culture of impunity for people who would murder or otherwise harm humanist activists. We've seen humanist activists shot at the roadside, 4 in the last 5 years, for the work they do in campaigning against superstition. And in other parts of the world where the consequence of humanist activism might be less severe, we've also seen a rising tide of discrimination, an increasing Christianization and religionization of public services, of education in countries where there are large state systems of education, of pastoral care in things like Western countries, military and elsewhere. So against that context, against that rising tide, there is nonetheless a Humanist International, we think, hope for the future. The number of humanist organizations around the world is growing. The number of non-religious people around the world continues to grow as well, both in number and in proportion, in spite of some of the propaganda that we see in global news media about religious groups being the ones on the rise. The non-religious are the fastest growing people in the world, and even in countries where they've previously been very few in number. And globally, the rise of social media in particular is allowing people to organize as never before. Obviously, I'm here talking to you, even though it's painfully early in the morning and I haven't had my tea yet. When you're all there on the other side of the world, that's a very obvious symptom of that development. But it's even more rewarding for humanists in Malaysia, for example, humanists in India scattered, humanists in Pakistan, to have the opportunity of social media to connect with each other in ways they couldn't before. And one of the reasons why there's a rising tide of observable persecution against humanists in name around the world today, is because there's a rising number of humanists. They're organizing, they're putting their heads above the parapet, they're meeting each other, they're connecting, they're doing all those things that bring them to, unfortunately, government attention in the first place. And that in itself is an underlying reason for optimism. So welcome as you step into this global humanist movement as a new organization. We look forward to working with you across all the dimensions that I've been talking about. And I can't wait for 12 hours time until I can raise a glass in toast to your launch. But for now, I'll content myself with the tea. So cheers.
Cheers, Andrew. Andrew, I must tell you that I had a phone call this morning from our member in Queensland, Zelda Bailey. And
Zelda.
She wanted to say how much she appreciated working with you. She sung your praises very highly, and she wanted to send a very warm hello.
Oh, how nice to hear from her. Are you saying she's back in Queensland?
Yes, she is.
Oh my goodness, I thought she was in London.
She made it just in time to escape the COVID.
Oh, she did. Ah.
And she has joined Humanists Australia. So
good. Well, we've all been waiting a long time to see a new organisation in Australia, and we're very much looking forward to it. Genuinely excited to work with you.
Thank you, Andrew. All right, I'd now like to introduce Franciscus Henri. Humanist Victoria is honoured to have as one of its members Franciscus Henri, a singer-songwriter beloved by Australian children. Just the other day, I was literally dancing in the kitchen with my grandson to his hit song, Dancing in the Kitchen with My Grandma. So let's all get out of our chairs and get some movement into our bodies with Franciscus. Over to you, Franciscus.
Now, this could be problematic. If I could sing, I would sing. What would I sing? I'd sing a song. Maybe you could sing along. And if you could dance, you could dance. What would you dance? You'd dance a dance. You'd be dancing to my song. Now the world is getting smaller. Plane flights getting longer. We could fly around the world, you know. And if I could go where I could go, I think I'd go to Kyoto or Tokyo, and we'd put on a show. Oh, we could make an MP3, people download for free, and we could live on bread and water. My life is getting longer, my songs are getting shorter. That's it. No, another song, one more song. Now this was written by a Cockney busker and poet by the name of Sydney Carter, who was very active in the 60s and called himself God's loyal opposition. I could go on for hours. I won't. I will sing what I think is one of the best songs ever written. The sheep's in the meadow and the cows in the corn. Now is the time for a child to be born. He'll laugh at the moon and he'll cry for the sun. And if he's a boy, he can carry a gun. Sang the crow on the cradle. And if it should be that our baby's a girl, now never you mind if her hair doesn't curl, with rings on her fingers and bells on her toes. And a bomber above her wherever she goes, sang the crow on the cradle. Oh, rock-a-bye, baby, the dark and the light. Somebody's baby was born for a fight. And rock-a-bye, baby, the white and the black. Somebody's baby is not coming back, sang the crow on the cradle. Your mummy and your daddy, they'll scrape and they'll say, they'll build you a coffin, they'll dig you a grave. But hush-a-bye, little one, why do you weep? 'Cause we've got a toy that'll put you to sleep, sang the crow on the cradle. Give me a gun and I'll shoot that bird dead. Oh, that's what your mummy and daddy once said. Oh, crow on the cradle, what shall I do? That is the thing that I'm leaving to you, sang the crow on the cradle.
Thank you so much, Franciscus.
Thank you.
Very serious.
I'd now like to introduce Fiona Patten, Member of the Victorian Parliament. Fiona is leader of the Reason Party, a future-focused, evidence-based movement committed to delivering equality, sustainability and freedom through new methods of political engagement and pragmatic consultation. This year, Fiona was recognised with the award of Australian Humanist of the Year for her outstanding achievements in leading debate and securing legislation on many issues of concern to humanists, particularly end of life, abortion safety, sexual health and drugs of addiction. Please welcome Fiona Patten.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I really pleased to be here. If I could just warn you that I'm actually, I'm still in Parliament, so the bells might ring, and there's a chance I may have to cut this short, but congratulations on establishing this new organisation and this new entity. And it was so great to hear Andrew Copson talk about the importance of humanism around the globe and the importance of national organisations such as this one that you're launching today and this weekend. If I could first start by acknowledging that I myself are on Wurundjeri land, and I'd pay my respects to the people, the Wurundjeri people and the people of the Kulin Nation, and certainly any elders who are here today, and understand that our Aboriginal brothers and sisters lived by probably a humanist approach to life, whether they had other beliefs, but they were based, their lives were based until it was taken on culture, environment, compassion, forgiveness, community, reason, and this is what we're here to celebrate today. So I feel quite humbled to be here today, and I've been asked to speak about Humanists Australia and human rights. And today in our Parliament, a bill was debated around conversion practices. So this is this horrendous practice of treating people from our LGBTIQ community as broken. And it was so inspiring hearing all of the different speakers speak for the abolishment and the effective prohibition of these types of practices in our churches and in our religious organisations around Australia. Of course, the one exception to that is the church right behind me. I often wonder whether I was given this office in Parliament because of the view from my room to try and remind me about this, but it does remind me every day that the power of that cathedral behind me in this Parliament, and the reasons why we need a humanist movement, and we need to be organised, and we need to challenge some of the power that comes from those spires. So when I was preparing for today, I was really surprised that Australia is the only Western democracy without some form of Charter of Rights, either legislated by Parliament or entrenched in its constitution. And that immediately prompts the question, do we need one? Are our human rights being compromised in its absence? But what we do have is a patchwork, a few individual rights given by our constitution, some further implied rights that have been read in by the High Court, international treaties that we've signed. They're not necessarily incorporated into law, and I think that we all know that they're not necessarily adhered to. And then a collage of state and federal anti-discrimination and anti-vilification legislation. And if you're lucky enough to live in Victoria or the ACT, we have some state-based human rights charters. But it would be easy to conclude that Australia is founded on the rule of law, and we have a strong tradition of respect for the rights and freedoms of every individual. That's probably when you compare ourselves against corrupt communist or religious regimes around the world. But we need barely scratch the surface to see that Australians' human rights record is not strong. In fact, it's probably quite deplorable. Whether that takes the form of poor health outcomes of our Indigenous Australians or mandatory and indefinite detention of asylum seekers. And certainly I'm particularly conscious of that. I have some asylum seekers who are detained in my own electorate and have not been allowed out of the Mantra Hotel in Preston for nigh on 10 months. They've been allowed 1 hour to go to the rooftop of that hotel each day. Being less bad is not a measure of success. So to answer that question, I think it's yes. And a yes, we need one. And yes, our human rights are being compromised. And I think this is certainly, when I look at the tenets and the values of Humanists Australia, we understand that. And yes, we must address this. And this is why organisations like Humanists Australia are so important. Understandably, there are concerns flagged by the obvious failings of the Bill of Rights in the US, a bill that holds kind of out-of-date concept as inherent rights that can't easily be changed. But at the other end of the spectrum, we've got what you could call the dialogue model of the Victorian Charter. It lacks sufficient teeth. Under this model, a Victorian court can't invalidate a law. It can only declare that a law does not comply with the Charter of Human Rights. And then it's up to the Parliament to amend the offending law as it sees fit. I'm in my 6th year here, and I am yet to see that happen. And in fact, I make this observation having sat on the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee for the last 2 years. And this committee is there pursuant to the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act of 2006, that we must consider any bill introduced into Parliament and must report to the Parliament whether the bill is incompatible with human rights. Now, really, I have seen not much more than lip service to this. We get a compatibility statement on each piece of legislation, and quite often the legislation is not compatible with the Charter. But the minister in charge of that piece of legislation will say, well, yes, it's not compatible, but we see that there's a need for this legislation anyway. And so there's not a lot of teeth in this, in the system that we have in Victoria. And I guess that's why we probably misunderstand the role of the Charter and think of it as a judicial power, where its real significance does lie in benchmarks it creates to influence the way we make new laws. And it probably does work in a good way, that every time you do introduce a bill and every time governments do make a law, they do need to give some consideration to that Charter. Now, whether they breach that Charter or whether they choose to introduce legislation that is incompatible with the Charter is another matter. And I think this is why charters need to have teeth, and what we have now goes some way to ensuring that human rights are considered when we introduce legislation, but it doesn't mean that legislation is not introduced that is in entire breach of people's human rights and does discriminate against others, and you know, rights of freedom and those sort of things are compromised in legislation, even with that Charter. So to be effective, we need to ensure that those failings are not repeated in an Australian Bill of Rights, acknowledging that at the end of the day, a Charter of Rights is the best mechanism to ensure that government intrusion on our liberties are reasonable and proportionate to achieve a legitimate end. The issue of reasonable and proportionate intrusions has never been more alive in our lifetime than it has been now with our experiences of COVID-19. And for those of you who live in Victoria, I know that you have been intimately involved in that intrusion and that I guess that curtailing of our freedoms, our freedom of movement, our freedom to work, so many of our freedoms. And since the state of emergency, which was declared on the 16th of March in Victoria, we've seen the Victorian government exercise a wide range of emergency powers to preserve public health, from curfews to restricting movement to requiring face masks in public. And in speaking to the Chief Health Officer on Monday about the state of emergency legislation, which is renewed every 4 weeks. And this is not dissimilar to other jurisdictions. Queensland is still operating under a state of emergency. WA, South Australia, other jurisdictions are still doing this as well. But when I spoke to him, he expected that Victoria will be in a state of emergency until at least December 2021. And this is mainly to enable things like hotel quarantine, which may be a necessary curtailment of human rights and of our freedoms. But it shines a light on the fact that human rights are not without limits. And it shows us just how important it is that any Bill of Rights ensures that limiting people's rights is only permitted when there is an important purpose and where government actions are proportionate to achieve that purpose. It's important that there is adequate evidence and justification and transparency, and that restrictions are time-bound and measures only remain in place as long as they're necessary. So I put this challenge. I mean, what could be more worthwhile cause for this new organisation to pursue than an Australian Charter of Human Rights, founded in human thought, in compassion, and in science, and probably in the values that this organisation is launching with. So mentioned before, compassion, community, reason, diversity, resolve, integrity, culture, environment, forgiveness. I almost want to steal your website for the Reason Party. It is so beautiful. As humanists say, we only have one life. And I definitely only have one political life to make a difference. And I've made it my priority in the Victorian Parliament to ensure that our rights are protected. And as Marianne mentioned, things like the right to voluntary assisted dying, things like the right to safe access to reproductive rights or abortion, the rights of children in foster care to have that adequate care, the rights to people to be able to get proper alcohol and drug treatment. So in finishing, I was in Parliament, and today actually is the last day of Parliament for Victoria for this year. But the other week I was walking through the corridors of Parliament, and as you can imagine, in a Victorian building, it's a rabbit warren. And this building was initially built in 1856, but has had a series of extensions going through to 2018. So there's lots of weird corridors. Anyway, I was walking through one, and it's not one that's often used by my colleagues because they're lazy and they choose to use the lift, where I choose to use the stairs. But I opened up this door and I just came face to face with the Premier. And you know, when you come face to face to someone at a doorway and you do that little dance, you know, where you go left, you go right. And we did that little dance for a moment. And then I kind of thought, right, I'm face to face with the Premier. And then as I continued walking, I just came to think of it as kind of this metaphor that, you know, sometimes like I'm a small party, but I like to think that I'm a warrior. And sometimes your voice has got to be heard, and you've just kind of got to get right up in their face. And I think this is what Humanists Australia can do. You know, I will always try and be in the government's face when it comes to the basic rights of human rights. And I think that's what I will always fight for. And I look forward to working with and being part of Humanists Australia to move on this, to move on human rights. And certainly, you know, if in my lifetime or even in the next few years, we could see a proper Bill of Rights for Australia, I think that reflects the secular notions of this nation, the the optimistic values that this new organisation has put forward. It's a challenge that I put to you, but I think it's something that we should all join in fighting for, and that's a Bill of Rights for this country to protect our human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I was very, very touched by your tribute to our website. It's very dear to my heart, especially the value.
It's terrific, Marianne. It's absolutely terrific. I really enjoyed looking through it over the last few days.
That's great to hear. The illustrations on our values page were done by Simon Kneebone, an Adelaide cartoonist. Yes.
Congratulations.
So tomorrow is it's our activities day tomorrow, and we're talking about one of our goals, education. I'm doing a session on what is humanism, in which I will go through each of those values and describe how they fit in with answers to fundamental questions of human existence. So that is tomorrow from 2 o'clock. It will be recorded, as this session has been, and be available on our website for those who can't catch it then. So that wraps up our Human Rights Day official launch. As I mentioned, Launch at Palooza continues tomorrow. The first session tomorrow is at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, in this same Zoom room, with a panel session on Humanists Australia activities, in which we'll describe the kinds of things that we are planning on doing and that we have done in the past through the various humanist societies, some of which will now be run through Humanists Australia. I hope we see you at our sessions tomorrow. You can view the full schedule of events on our website, humanistaustralia.org. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.